Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this one-day UVA virtual talk series. My name is Susan Lynch. I am the Associate Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. We have registrants for this program from 43 states across the country and 9 countries around the world. So welcome to everybody participating today. Before starting the program, I want to provide some quick housekeeping items. To engage with the audience, our speaker will answer questions submitted before and during the program as time allows. You may enter a question in the webinar Q&A. Please add your name and UVA affiliation. As noted, we have received many questions at the time of registration and they have been shared with our speakers, so there is no need to repeat the questions in this live session. You'll find resources in the webinar chat. Please also note this program is being recorded and will soon be posted in Lifetime Learning's podcast library. So let me introduce our speaker. Christopher Ali is an associate professor in the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. He's also the Knight News Innovation Fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. His research interests include communication policy and regulation, rural broadband, critical political economy, critical geography, comparative media systems, media localism, and local news. Professor Ali's current research focuses on broadband policy and deployment in the United States, specifically in rural areas. In his new book that we will discuss today, Fresh Broadband, The Politics of Rural Connectivity, he examines the complicated terrain of rural broadband policy in the United States. Fresh unpacks the politics of broadband policy, asking why millions of rural Americans lack broadband access and why the federal government and large providers are not doing more to connect the unconnected. So thank you again for joining us for this Lifetime Learning program. Now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Ali to discuss his interesting new book and the rural and urban digital divide. So Chris, please take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides here. And then we can get started. So I thought today I wanted to talk about the rural urban digital divide and the hope of a connected future. And again, really what we're doing here is we're talking about broadband. We're specifically talking about rural broadband, which is something that the pandemic has made painfully clear over the last almost 2 years now, is the importance of not just any type of broadband, but a high performing, high quality and affordable home broadband subscription. So just a couple of take-home points for us as we get started. First and foremost, broadband is not a luxury. It is a necessity and is a utility. Second, broadband is important for every aspect of contemporary life. Third, tens of millions of Americans remain and underconnected. And that's largely what we're going to be talking about today, is why is that the case, despite billions of dollars of federal investment? It's also important to remember that not all broadband connections are the same. And what exactly does that mean? And why do we have so many underconnected Americans throughout the country? And last but not least, we're going to discuss big changes that are coming for connectivity at the local, state, and federal levels, specifically with the infrastructure package that is going to be signed sometime today by President Biden. Of course, as Susan said, this is all found, well, I guess with the exception of the infrastructure package, found in my new book, Fresh Broadband, The Politics of Rural Connectivity, which was released in September. So the book is an analysis of federal and state policies regarding the subsidization of deployment and regulation of broadband to rural communities. And I like to say that the book is a story of failure and it's a story of promise. It's a story of failure largely because of the failure of policy at the federal level to correct the urban-rural digital divide. Now, when we talk about what is the digital divide, we often talk about it in terms of binaries. Either you have the internet or you don't have the internet. But the digital divide is actually plural and it's intersectional. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. But for my book, I concentrate on infrastructure. Why is it that rural Americans can't access the internet? Not because of affordability or skill set, but rather because the infrastructure is not there to allow them to do so. That I see as a failure of policy and a failure of markets. But the book is also a story of promise and a story of successes. And here I profile communities across the country, including here in Virginia, who have taken it upon themselves to connect themselves in the absence of a lot of policy support. In fact, I dedicate an entire chapter in the book to Rock County, Minnesota, the nutcracker capital of the Midwest, and how they managed to get 99.93% fiber to the home in just 1 year. So the book, again, a failure and a story of promise. So how did I do what I said I was going to do? Well, it first and foremost started with a massive amount of policy analysis. Roughly 15,000 pages of policy was analyzed, mainly policies regarding decisions from the Federal Communications Commission and the US Department of Agriculture. I conducted over 90 in-depth interviews with experts. And then going through all of this, something I realized was that maybe my readers don't find the nuances of broadband policy as absolutely fascinating and captivating as I do. So maybe I need to tell some stories. And so this began planning for what became the Rural Broadband Road Trip, where my hound dog Tuna and I drove 4,000 miles across the country, across the Midwest, talking to anyone and everyone who would speak with us. And this included providers and users and customers and local elected officials and restaurant owners and reporters, basically trying to figure out how the rural-urban digital divide is lived or not lived on a daily basis. And all of this I call in my book one of lived policy, trying to figure out how policy decisions are lived when folks are not living in Washington, D.C. or in the major centers. So this is a story of lived policy here. And the argument of the book, and this is a little bit of a, I guess, a spoiler alert, as the kids might say. The argument of the book is that rural broadband policy is both broken and it is incomplete. And it is broken and it is incomplete because of the massive amount of rules, because of infighting between different agencies, and most importantly, because over the last 15 years, we have tended, or at least federal policy has tended to favor the largest and the loudest providers, the big, large-scale national providers, over the thousands of local, regional, and much more nimble internet service providers. And this is really where we see the problem of rural broadband policy, the favoring of the largest national telecommunications companies. And I'm going to talk about what I mean by that and provide some evidence to that in a couple of slides. But let's start with a question that is, simple to ask, very complicated to answer. What is broadband? I mean, we all say that we need it. We all say that we want it. We all get frustrated when it doesn't work. We all get frustrated when Comcast charges us too much money. But what exactly is it? The Federal Communications Commission defines broadband as an always-on internet connection of 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. So it uses a speed definition. Another definition of broadband may be one we're a little bit more familiar with from our everyday lives, and that comes from the Congressional Research Service, which says that broadband is provided by a series of technologies that gives users the ability to send and receive data at volumes and speeds necessary to support a number of applications, including voice communication, entertainment, telemedicine, distance education, telework, e-commerce, civic engagement, public safety, and energy conservation. Broadband, therefore, is next generation internet connectivity. But let's focus on the speed thing for a second. What on earth does 25.3 mean? 25 megabits per second down, 3 megabits per second up. Well, if you have 25.3 at your home and you live alone, you can probably easily stream Netflix. That's not going to be a problem. It would be difficult at that speed, however, for a family of 4 to each be on their own Zoom call, right? And that's because the amount of bandwidth necessary to kind of fuel all of these different programs. So again, while 25.3 might be all right for, binging, catching up on what am I catching up on these days? Riverdale, a terrible analogy, but yeah, catching up on Riverdale on Netflix. It's not going to be good enough for me to be on Zoom, somebody else to be gaming, and somebody else to be on Netflix. And I say this because the definition of broadband ends up being a rather interesting political fight here in the United States. So now that we have a definition of broadband, let's talk about where it is. According to the Federal Communications Commission, 95.6% of the country keep this number in mind. 95.6% of the country has access to broadband. And I'm going to ask you all to keep this in mind because we're going to problematize this a little later. This includes 98.8% of the urban population, 82.7% of the rural population, and 79.1% of the tribal population. Again, keep these numbers in mind because we're going to come back to them. Certainly, COVID has made the importance of broadband to contemporary life painfully clear. The United Nations said that broadband access was a matter of life and death during the pandemic. An interesting study found that those with high performance broadband are more likely to social distance than those without. The term high performance broadband, of course, coming from Jonathan Sallet of the Benton Institute. Students with broadband will likely have a GPA that is at least half a letter grade higher than students without. So that's so significant, right? Just the presence of broadband, a stable broadband connection in a home can raise GPA, excuse me. And those without broadband have been forced to use the Wi-Fi signals in the parking lots of McDonald's and libraries. Before the pandemic, but certainly now even afterwards, what I've focused on what I call the pillars of rural broadband. Why is it that we need broadband, ubiquitous broadband throughout the country, but specifically in rural areas that don't have it? Broadband has been shown to have a benefit on 6 different aspects of contemporary life. Economic development, broadband tends to lower unemployment and raise GDP. It also raises housing value. In fact, if you have a fiber optic connection in your house is valued at 3.1% more than if it didn't have it. Education, as we just saw, broadband has the potential to raise GPA of students. Healthcare, everything from trying to get a COVID appointment or COVID vaccine to doctors doing patient filing systems. Civic engagement, you are more likely to connect with a local leader if you have a broadband connection. Quality of life. I mean, we might laugh at the fact that no one likes it when their Netflix buffers, but still no one likes it when their Netflix buffers. Everything from watching Netflix to playing games to shopping to communicating with grandma. I mean, all of this contributes to quality of life. And this is the area I think that was made most apparent during the pandemic. And last but not least, and then certainly public safety. A robust, ubiquitous broadband network in the United States can aid in public safety and first responders. So I think there's 2 ways. Remember, I said that my book was about failure and about promise. Another way to think about it is that rural broadband policy is about hopes and heartbreaks. So I want to talk a little bit about the heartbreak of rural broadband policy first, and then we'll get into some of the hopes and the more exciting stuff. So taking a look at broadband at the 50,000 mile high view. Right now, 42 million Americans lack access to broadband. And here the FCC claims that number is closer to 20 million. So pay attention to this discrepancy here. Microsoft, however, notes that 120 million Americans, almost half the population, lack access to the internet at broadband speeds. So this is when I said that not all broadband is created equal. Just because you can access the internet doesn't mean you can do so at broadband speeds. More people lack access to broadband because they cannot afford a subscription, not because of infrastructure. And this is one of the kind of great myths when we talk about the digital divide, is that it's only a rural-urban issue and that it's only about infrastructure. It turns out it's so much bigger than that, and affordability is one of the most important topics here. Unconnected communities, however, those who are suffering from a lack of infrastructure, are typically found in rural and tribal areas, although underconnected communities are certainly everywhere. And like I said before, the digital divide is intersectional. Rural, low-income, immigrant, tribal, Black, Latinx, LGBTQ communities are more likely not to have broadband at home. And lastly, like I just said, the digital divide is not only about infrastructure, but about affordability, inclusion, and digital equity. So some more heartbreaks of rural broadband for you. Sorry about this. 18% of rural school children lack access to a home broadband subscription. Only 72% of rural Americans who can access a broadband network have a home subscription. Only 19% of rural Americans have a choice in provider. And rural Americans pay more, significantly more for home broadband subscription, largely because of a lack of this competition. All right, some other heartbreaks. Remember I said that this definition of speed is problematic. Well, here's why. So right now, the FCC defines broadband as an always-on internet connection of 25 megabits per second download, 3 megabits per second upload. That's old news to us in this call now. That definition was set back in 2015. So one of the major arguments here is that it does not account for current usage or current needs. Right now, the average speed in the United States is 192 megabits per second download, 68 megabits per second upload. But worse than this, worse than failing to account for current needs, it's also asymmetric in that it privileges consumption, it privileges download over production, over business, over upload. And that makes it really difficult for businesses to do their work. If you think about it in terms of farmers generate an incredible amount of data, terabytes worth of data, because right now you can have sensors monitoring every single ear of corn, right? Without a fast upload speed, that farmer is going to have to download all of their data onto a USB stick, then drive it either to their home, or if they don't have broadband at the home, then to a closest town with a fiber optic connection, right? So this asymmetric definition is certainly something that is holding us back. Here's an interesting fact for you. 2.1 million Americans, excuse me, and 60,000 farms still use dial-up. Dial-up, of course, being the internet we used in the 90s, right? You might remember the that kind of ubiquitous modem sound when you dialed it. 2.1 Americans and 60,000 farms still use dial-up. Think about that. That's pretty crazy. All right. So other heartbreaks. Remember, I asked you all to keep those numbers in your head about how many Americans have access to broadband. That number was somewhere around 95.6%. Well, it's actually not. It turns out that the FCC's data is entirely wrong. And it is entirely wrong by upwards of 50%, which means that the FCC has over-exaggerated the number of Americans connected to the internet by at least 50%. Broadband Now, for instance, found that 42 million Americans, not the 17 million reported by the FCC, lack access to broadband. US Telecom found that there are 38% more broadband deserts in the United States than the FCC predicted. And of course, as I already said, Microsoft said that 120 million Americans lack access to the internet at broadband speeds. So how is this possible? How are we in a situation where we are about to spend $65 billion on broadband thanks to the infrastructure package, and yet we do not know who is unconnected and who is underconnected? Well, this is where the policies and politics collide. Right now, the way that the FCC collects data, and I say right now, but knowing that this is actually changing in real time. But previously, the FCC collected data using what was called Form 477. This allows internet service providers to self-report data that is very seldom audited. One of the major problems here is that data is collected at the census block level. Now, a census block is a collection of addresses. It could be a couple of streets, could be a couple of neighborhoods. In Alaska, it's 85,000 square miles. But using this census block means that we don't have granular data. We don't have data that is parcel by parcel by parcel or house by house by house. So what the FCC says is that if an ISP can say that at least one building in a census block has broadband, that entire census block is considered 100% served. I'll say that again. So long as one building in a census block has broadband, the entire census block is considered 100% served. And having broadband doesn't actually just mean having broadband. It just means that that building can potentially be served by a provider within 10 business days. So this is one of the major ways in which the FCC has overcounted the number of connected Americans. There are two other major flaws with this data collection process. The first is that ISPs only have to report advertised speeds, not actual speeds. And this is significant for older networks. So for instance, if you have a DSL connection, a digital subscriber line, There's a number of problems with the difference between advertised speeds and actual speeds. Sure, they could advertise that it gets up to maybe 100 megabits per second down, 20 megabits per second up. But DSL rots really quickly, and the signal degrades after about 3 miles. So if you're more than 3 miles away, you are not getting anywhere near the advertised speeds. But because ISPs only have to report advertised speeds, not actual speeds, more Americans look like they're being served. Last but not least, the FCC is not publishing pricing data. So we must also ask ourselves, is broadband actually available if it's being priced at $150 a month? That's a huge expense for so many families, particularly during a time of the pandemic. So again, the FCC has greatly exaggerated what's been going on in terms of broadband. And I just want to share a little bit of my own research right now. This is from a follow-up project to my book, where we were looking at the role of counties here in Virginia in broadband planning and policy. And one of the really interesting things that we found is that in Orange County, the FCC reports that Orange County is 100% served at 25.3 with at least 2 providers. That means that according to the FCC, every person in Orange County can choose between one of 2 providers to give them broadband at 25.3. Well, when we asked Orange County this question, Orange County reported to us that roughly 5% of the county was served with broadband. So the FCC's data was wrong by about 94.77%. That's the kind of discrepancy that we're talking about between more on the ground data and what's going on at the commission. Oh, we already saw this slide, excuse me. I'm trying to follow the chat. So there are some improvements along the way. The Broadband Data Act of 2020 orders the FCC to change its methodological and data collection practices. And in fact, they're actually starting to do so. They had a call for proposals, they picked a winner. So hopefully, we'll start to see some better, more granular broadband maps in the future. The National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the NTIA, has also released its own map, which does some interesting work mapping FCC data on top of income levels. So you can see where there are affordability issues. And last but not least, states are starting to create their own broadband maps in the absence of a kind of trustworthy federal map. And Georgia is the leader here. Okay, so I have got one more heartbreak for all of us, and then we're going to move on to the hopes. This heartbreak here has to do with money. Before the pandemic, we were spending about $6 billion a year specifically on rural broadband deployment. This is not to do with schools and hospitals and libraries, and this is not to do with affordability. This is just about getting wires in the ground, $6 billion a year. That came from 2 different pots of money. The Universal Service Fund, which is a tax on consumers. You'll find that it's in your telephone bill all the time, USF. The FCC manages that and allocates about $5 billion in grants for broadband deployment. And USDA has its own set of money, about $1.4 billion in loans and grants. So between 2009 and 2017, we have spent $47 billion on broadband. And here's the interesting thing. In 2017, the FCC estimated that it would cost $80 billion to connect the country with fiber. So, okay, if we had $47 billion and it will cost $80 billion to collect the country, you would think we'd be more than halfway there with fiber optic connections, but that is not at all the case. And the reason for that has everything to do with politics. So here's some examples. When the FCC started funding broadband in 2014, it gave $1 billion a year to the 10 largest telecommunications companies, right? And they would get $1 billion a year, not per company, in total for 6 years. So from 2015 to 2021. These companies had very, very slow build out requirements. They only had to build a network that could get up to 10 megabits per second down, 1 megabit per second up. Remember, the national average is 25.3, or national definition was 25.3. So they only had to build below average. And there was very little accountability for this money. In fact, there was so little accountability that in 2018 and 2019, 2 companies failed to live up to their promises. They were not met with sanctions or punishments, but instead were given another year of funding and were allowed to compete in another competition for more money. So that was called the Connect America Phase 2. There is a different set of money, another $1 billion, and this goes to 175 small telecommunication companies. So keep in mind, 10 giant companies shared $1 billion. 175 companies shared another $1 billion. These 175 small companies had a much larger build-out requirement. They were required to build out to networks of 25.3. They're the ones who are really deploying the fiber optics in rural America, and there was much more accountability. So we're seeing much more movement at the local and regional level for providers than we are at the national level. And a lot of this is because policy was favoring the national large-scale providers over the smaller local regional cooperatives and private providers who are much more nimble and able to connect their communities. We saw this kind of historical trend play out once again just last year with what was called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. This is the FCC's new program. It's $20.4 billion over 10 years. The first kind of auction for this money took place in 2020. $9.2 billion was allocated. But the FCC did not do its due diligence and is now asking for money back from some of these providers because it ended up funding areas like parking lots, traffic circles, and uninhabited parks. So again, without the kind of due diligence, the money went to a lot of the largest providers, such as LTD Broadband or Starlink, when the FCC did not actually do its diligence to figure out where actually are they going to be providing broadband, and moreover, are the technologies that they're using capable of delivering the speeds? So what I'm trying to get at here is that history tends to repeat itself when it comes to rural broadband policy. And that history means the favoring of the largest and the loudest, kind of the sexiest providers over the much more local, regional, much more nimble providers. So this gets us into the hopes. I'm just checking my watch here to make sure that we're on time. I think we're doing well on time here. So the hope of rural broadband policy. And in my mind and in my research, the hope lays with communities. Communities are doing it for themselves. Communities across the country are connecting themselves despite policy and market failures. This is often done with telephone and electric cooperatives, who I call the unsung heroes of rural broadband. And for those of you on this call from Virginia, you might recognize CVEC, the Central Virginia Electric Cooperative, and its subsidiary Firefly Broadband, as definitely one of the heroes of connecting the Commonwealth. We're also seeing a lot of really important emphasis being put on public-private partnerships. So in my book, and this is it's quite a good selfie of me actually. I profile Rock County, Minnesota, which is located in the southwest pocket of the state, neighboring South Dakota and Iowa. Rock County, population 10,000, county seat of Laverne, which is also called the Nutcracker capital of the Midwest, wanted a fiber optic network. To do so, they partnered with Alliance Communications, which is a telephone cooperative out of South Dakota. They received a $5 million grant from the Minnesota Broadband Office. The county bonded itself through its wind turbine surplus for $1 million a year over 10 years. And Alliance Communications funded the rest of the network. Rock County is now the most connected county in the state of Minnesota with 99.93% fiber optic coverage. I mean, that is just amazing. And they were able to do so because of this great intersection between digital champions at the local level, a state who knew what it was doing and would support municipal efforts for broadband, and a public-private partnership with Alliance Communication. Just an absolutely fantastic story. And I would encourage anyone who's doing a road trip to Minnesota to check out Rock County, Minnesota. They also have a really good library. So like I said, cooperatives end up being some of the unsung heroes of broadband. A lot of electric cooperatives got their start in the 1930s, with what was called the Rural Electrification Administration. And this was a program of FDR to connect the countryside, to connect rural communities with electricity. It was a tremendously successful program that was predicated on the REA giving out loans to electric cooperatives for power. And it was so successful, in fact, that it started doing it with telephone in the 1950s. Today, all telephone cooperatives and over 200 electric cooperatives are offering high-speed broadband. Like municipal options, co-ops primarily operate where big telco companies refuse to offer service. They often offer faster speeds at lower costs for consumers. And last but not least, but this is really important, cooperatives see broadband as an investment in the community and are willing to take a longer return on investment than the quarterly returns demanded by large investor-owned companies. And again, here I'm going to point to an example from home. This is Firefly Broadband out of Nelson County. It's owned and operated by Central Virginia Electric Cooperative beginning in 2018, and has a build-out plan for 4 years of a cost of $120 million for 4,000 miles of fiber and service to 37,000 households. It's been quite successful in receiving grants at both the federal and state level. And now it offers a gig, so that's 1,000 megabits per second download, 1,000 megabits per second upload for $79.99. Recently, they announced they're going to move outside of Nelson into Louisa, Appomattox, Buckingham, Albemarle, Powhatan, Fluvanna, and Spotsylvania counties. So really exciting things happening in our backyard here in Virginia when it comes to broadband. So if you haven't guessed it out now, I am a huge fan of local broadband providers. And in fact, I argue in my book that local broadband is the best broadband. And here I mean the importance of counties, municipalities, small and regional providers, and cooperatives, both electric and telephone. Local is getting it done. We saw some tremendous amount of community resiliency during COVID with regards to broadband. And just a couple of really cool experiments I want to highlight here included enabling school buses with Wi-Fi and then parking those in underconnected neighborhoods. We saw libraries expanding their Wi-Fi signals into parking lots. We saw schools asking to become neighborhood Wi-Fi providers. Louisa County experimented with some really awesome solar-powered hotspots. And we saw a number of libraries start getting into hotspot loan programs, where if you didn't have broadband at home, you could rent out a hotspot from a library and take it home and be able to connect. So this has been given the term broadband localism. And I think it's really broadband localism at its finest during the pandemic. So other Virginia initiatives, we're seeing a lot more electric cooperatives getting into broadband, most recently Rappahannock Electric Cooperative. We're seeing a really interesting program here in the Commonwealth with Dominion Power and Appalachian Power. Now, these are not cooperatives. These are kind of traditional investor-owned utilities. But what they've been allowed to do, thanks to a change in Virginia law, is to open up their middle mile. That's their connection of fiber optic networks that are linking all of their substations. And now they're going to partner with a last mile provider, which is a retail broadband provider. So they're going to give them the middle mile or partner with a middle mile if someone will build out to homes. Facebook, of all things, recently announced that it was going to enter in a partnership to offer internet backhaul through its fiber optic networks. We're seeing lots of county broadband plans, and we're seeing a lot of really interesting county use of CARES Act funding. Now let's take a look at what's happening at the federal level. So really cool things happening here in Virginia at the federal level. This will include the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. This was actually passed in December 2020, and it created a $3.2 billion emergency broadband benefit program that is meant to subsidize broadband subscriptions for low-income families, $50 a month or $75 a month on tribal land. It also had $1 billion for tribal connectivity, $300 million for rural broadband, and $285 million for broadband at historically Black universities and colleges and universities. We also saw the CARES Act, which offered directly $100 million to USDA for its Reconnect program, but also its kind of unattributed allocations meant that counties were able to use CARES Act money in really cool ways. So Nelson County, for instance, gave a large percentage of its CARES Act money directly to Firefly Broadband to continue its expansion of fiber to the home. With the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, we saw general state funds at $220 billion for state support, $10 billion for state infrastructure, which includes broadband, and $7 billion for schools and library connectivity. Here in Virginia, this is really interesting. This summer, I guess last summer, summer 2021, Governor Northam announced that $700 million from Virginia's ARPA allocation. Virginia got $4.3 billion from ARPA, and $700 million of which is pledged to go to broadband deployment. We haven't seen a lot of rules and regulations written about this money yet, so that's definitely something to be on the lookout for. We also have a yearly $50 million fund called the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative, and another $11 million yearly from the Tobacco Commission. Thanks to this $700 million pledge, Governor Northam has a plan for universal service in Virginia, universal connectivity by 2024. All right, so now we come to the big kahuna, the infrastructure bill. $65 billion for broadband out of an over $1 trillion infrastructure package. This includes $4.25 billion for deployment, $14 billion for affordability, $2.7 billion for digital equity, $2 billion for travel connectivity, $2 billion for USDA, but not the Reconnect program. This is an error on my end. It was not for Reconnect, it was for their distance learning program. So $2 billion for USDA's distance learning program, $1 billion for middle mile expansion, and $600 million for tax exempt bonds. Tremendous amount of money. This is the largest single public investment in telecommunications in this country's history, which is why the history lesson that we kind of already went through is so very important. Two other things that it ordered is a report on revising the Universal Service Fund. Right now, how we fund broadband, or how the FCC does, is, like we said before, that tax on consumers. And Congress wants us to reevaluate, or wants the FCC to reevaluate how that is funded. We're also going to see a broadband pricing label mandate. So just like you'll have a nutritional outline on your cereal box, you're going to start to be able to access a broadband label, pricing label for your subscription. So providers aren't going to be able to hide any mysterious costs anymore. So in terms of kind of my own thoughts, or dare I say some hot takes on the infrastructure package, 65 billion is certainly nothing to scoff at, although it does fall short of the original promise of $100 billion, $80 billion of which would go to deployment. And that 80 billion is significant because remember back in 2017, the FCC said that it would cost $80 billion to connect this country with fiber. And then there's a couple of concerns here, and this is where I'm worried that history might repeat itself if we don't remain vigilant. The first is that broadband is continued to be defined at 25.3. So they're still using that really slow, really outdated metric of broadband. Underserved, however, is defined at 120, which is good. We like seeing that number appear. The NTIA will be distributing these funds, not the FCC. As we've seen, the FCC has historically failed to do their due diligence when it comes to large-scale broadband funding. So hopefully NTIA will do better. They've got a good track record already, so I'm excited to see what they're going to do with this program. There is a lack of protection for municipalities and cooperatives. In the original drafting of the infrastructure package, municipalities, cooperatives, nonprofits, these were all singled out and prioritized. That prioritization kind of went through the cutting block of political compromise, so to speak. And now all it says is that you can't discriminate against these providers. And for those of you who are interested in reading more, I actually have an op-ed out in the Washington Monthly magazine this weekend talking about why that's problematic, why we actually need to be prioritizing local providers. The reason is that some are concerned that because of this lack of prioritization, that we're going to see kind of big telecommunications companies and big cable companies kind of come in and gobble up a lot of this money. So this is definitely something to be looking out for. All right, so what can we do? What can you do? We've got a couple hundred people on this call. What's our next steps as a group here now that I've all dubbed you broadband experts? Well, one of the big things you can do is take a speed test. You are paying for possible speeds, not actual speeds. So being able to actually understand the type of speeds that you get at home regularly is incredibly powerful. So I'd recommend you all take a speed test. We can become familiar with the different technologies of broadband and the providers that offer them. And for those of you who are interested in this, I wrote a piece, it's publicly available, called Everything You Wanted to Know About Broadband But Was Afraid to Ask. And there I kind of unpack all the different technologies of broadband and their pros and cons. We can become broadband champions for your community. Even if you're living in a community in which connectivity is high, there will always be a subset that is and underconnected. Who are those people and how can we champion connectivity everywhere? Last but not least, we can talk to our city council members and our boards of supervisors. Counties are going to play a tremendous role in the next generation of digital connectivity. So making sure that your counties on board are going to be incredibly important. All right, so a couple of conclusions as we wind this out, because I think I'm doing all right on time. I argue in my book, and I argued in the New York Times, that we need a national rural broadband plan to cut through a lot of this clutter. We need to remind lawmakers and policymakers that local broadband is the best broadband. We need to make sure that history does not repeat itself when it comes to the infrastructure package. And we need to make sure that at the end of the day, we remember that broadband is not about technologies, companies, or policies. It is about people. I'm going to beg your indulgence right now and read you an excerpt from my book. And it's around this term, everything is better with better broadband. It's actually the last page of my book, which I'm actually holding up right here. And I think it does a good job at kind of encapsulating all of this, and it also kind of, punctuate the end of our conversation. So here we go. I'm continually struck by something Bernadine Jocelyn, Director of Public Policy and Engagement at Minnesota's Blandin Foundation, told me in her interview for this book. Everything is better with better broadband. I repeat it here and throughout this book to shed a clear, bright light on a complex issue. This is not a technologically determinist argument. The mere existence of broadband in a rural community does not correct rural inequality ipso facto, although the lack of connectivity certainly does not help. Instead, I invoke this phrase to demonstrate how broadband, rural broadband, and broadband policy are lived and experienced, or not, on the ground in rural communities throughout the country. Broadband policy, such as it is, may be written in Washington with legal prose refined at the headquarters of AT&T, Verizon, CenturyLink, Windstream, and Frontier, but it's lived in Laverne, Minnesota, McKee, Kentucky, and Mineral, Virginia. At its furthest reach, Jocelyn's phrase parallels conversations occurring at the United Nations and the European Union about whether internet access can be called a human right, akin to the rights to information, education, and participation. Closer to home, it reminds us that at the end of the day, broadband is not about policy, politics, technology, or money. It is about people. When deployed democratically and harnessed inclusively, everything can be better with better broadband, from homework to work, to voting, to health, to talking to grandma. Everything is better with better broadband is a call to end the rural-urban digital divide and the multitude of digital divides brought on by inequality in the United States. So with those words, I want to thank you so much for coming today. Thank you so much for your attention and your interest in this issue of broadband. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email address is here, my Twitter handle is here, and I'm very much looking forward to keeping this conversation going and to answering some of your great questions. Thank you very much again.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Chris, for all that information. So let's get to some questions. We've had a lot of them submitted before and during the program. So John Herman, who's an alum, says that there have been a lot of failed attempts to reach rural America. It seems the only way to gain this reach is via wireless. And why doesn't the FCC, when they auction off spectrum to the wireless carriers, demand a certain level of coverage at a specific minimum of broadband? He's saying, I don't believe continuing to fund fiber to farms using mom and pop local providers will provide an operationally sustainable solution. What do you think about that?
That's a great question, John. Thank you. I've often argued that solving the rural-urban digital divide in terms of infrastructure is not going to be a one-stop shop. It's going to be all hands on deck. So it's going to need that wireless approach. It's going to need that fiber approach. It's going to need those mom and pop ISPs. It's going to need WISPs, wireless internet service providers. And yes, it might even need the national and large-scale providers as well. I think you're absolutely right. When it comes to fiber to the farm, that's a bit of a misnomer, because obviously, and I don't mean to sound glib here, but we can't exactly plug a combine into a fiber optic cable. We need a high performance fixed wireless solution for rural communities. I think one of the vexing things that we saw was during the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction, when some WISPs over exaggerated what they were able to do with connectivity. And I think that actually gave them a bad name. I mean, wireless is going to be a major part of rural broadband, and it is a major part of rural broadband. But we have to understand that there are also limitations to wireless provision. It can't possibly match the type of connectivity that fiber optics can bring. So I agree that we have to be mindful of the hype, just like we have to be mindful of the hype of 5G and LEOs. Fiber does come with hype. Fiber is also very expensive, but I do think that at the end of the day, I mean, fiber is the best option if you can get it. And the second would be for me a kind of fiber fueled fixed wireless network, again with that fiber optic backhaul. To your question of how the FCC allocates performance or allocates areas, I mean, it definitely depends on what part of the spectrum is being auctioned off. You know, if they're using that much more localized function, which privileges local providers, can't remember what auction it was now, maybe the 2.5 gigahertz range with PAL, the ability to target, that's going to be different than if you're offering kind of large scale spectrum auctions. I think what I'd like to see from the FCC first and foremost, though, is accountability, right? We're not seeing a lot of the accountability, particularly from large providers. I mean, in 2019, it was demonstrated, the FCC found in a report that large mobile providers had exaggerated their coverage by 40%. 40%, that's bananas. And yet we're not met with any discernible punishments, right? So we need to get accountability first and foremost. If you're going to win federal money, you got to show up. Thank you for that question.
Great. So let's follow up on the FCC part. So Jess Hayes, who's asked the question in the live chat, he said he's read the book, he loved it. He's informative, and he has learned so much, but he's curious to learn more about the FCC and what have your interactions been with the FCC? Have you conducted interviews with them, the leaders, the doers? And he's excited to hear more since they control so much of the funding and their oversight is, he said, understandably critiqued in the book. So do they realize how broken they are is the question.
I think that, thank you for that question. It's a great question. I think they've quickly learned how broken they are. I think we had a previous administration of the FCC that in which, you know, big cable and big telco could do no wrong. And we saw a tremendous amount of favoring of those, including the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which has doled out hundreds of millions of dollars with very little accountability. This current FCC is really trying, I think, I'm going to give them credit. I think they're really trying to right their wrongs, both in terms of where that money went for RDOF and also trying to, you know, change the mapping and the methodology there. But this is systemic, right? I mean, this is not the first time the FCC has been, you know, doing, I don't want to say doing the bidding, but at least been captured by the interest of industry. This has been going on for decades, right? If it wasn't, you know, big telco before that, it was broadcasters, and before that, AT&T as the monopoly provider. So there always is a tremendous amount of pressure on the FCC to favor big telco. I think that this current iteration has the potential to do a lot of good. I, for one, championed the president's announcement that he will push for acting chair Jessica Rosenworcel to become permanent chair, and then to add Gigi Sohn as the new Democratic commissioner. So I think that's great. I have had personal interactions with the FCC, although only on one side of the political divide. I will leave it to your imagination as to which side takes my calls and which side does not. And they get it. They really do. The leadership does. So I'm excited to see this next kind of iteration of the FCC. But again, you know, this is where what my book has certainly taught me is that history, we cannot afford for history to repeat itself. We cannot afford for all of this money just to go into the hands of the largest providers with very little in return. I'd like to think the FCC is aware of that. I did send them a copy of the book. It was a little cheeky, but you know, they might read it. But I think I'm excited to see what this new iteration of the FCC, once Rosenworcel and Sohn are confirmed, to see what they're going to do in the public interest and in consumer interest.
Okay, great. So Jamie Robinson, who's an alum, says, as a nurse, I'm interested in policies that improve technology access to rural residents, specifically as it can be used to improve access to care via phone, text, Zoom, or other telehealth care delivery methods. And what barriers do you see to gardening that technology needed to facilitate telehealth, specifically for rural Virginians?
That's a great question. Thank you. And I think the same barriers to participation in telehealth are the same barriers to participation in any other kind of digital component. That's three things. One, high performance, high speed, infrastructure in the ground or in the air, right? You need to have that connection. 2, affordability. Is it affordable? 3, device access. We seldom think about, do you actually have access to a computer? Do you have access to a tablet? Do you have access to a smartphone? These are questions that we still need to be asking. We can't, and I wrote about this in a piece that I called the presumption of the connected. And I think that's something the pandemic really made clear, is that not only is not everyone connected, not everyone has access to the technologies that I certainly take for granted, right? I've got a laptop here, I've got a couple screens, I've got 2 tablets, I've got a phone, and I have an internet connection fast enough to make that happen, and I make enough that I can afford it, regardless of how much Comcast tries to gouge me, right? But that's not the case, and it's that much more difficult in rural communities. And so those would be the 3 barriers, and we are seeing some movement. I want to say the CARES Act. Don't quote me on that one, it's just off the top of my head, did give more money to the FCC's telehealth program. So we are seeing some movement there, but I think once, we start to see those 3 factors of the digital divide start to shrink, the boon for telehealth is going to be dramatic, because there's so many possibilities that are unexplored just because we don't have access to a network, we can't afford the network, or we don't have access to devices.
Great. So Elizabeth Jackson, who's a faculty and staff person here at UVA, asked during the COVID-19 in 2020, many K-12 students fell behind due to a lack of internet. Those living in poor rural counties suffered this the most, and this poses an equity issue. So what can educators, school boards, and lawmakers do to get students connected?
That's a great question. The first thing we can do is don't presume connectivity exists. And I'm going to put us in that category because I think one of the things we forgot during the pandemic is when we talk about what's called the homework gap, right? Those students who can do their homework online, those students who can't extend beyond K through 12. But I'm going to pivot back to K through 12. So certainly we can do things like surveys. We need to be asking our students, can you do this? Or asking parents in the case of, young kids, can you do this? Do you have a good enough connection to watch a video? Do you have a good enough connection to have a 2-way conversation? Can you download something off the internet? Are there certain times that you can do this at? Would you prefer pre-recorded, right? Libraries have become incredibly important in loaning out hotspots for un- and underconnected students. There is a big push at the Federal Communications Commission to make permanent a plan that they did during the pandemic, which did allow schools to push out their Wi-Fi signals into the neighboring community, so that if you were around the school, you didn't actually just have to be in like the parking lot or the playground. If you were in a home, even you'd be close enough to get the school's Wi-Fi connection. That was actually not allowed before this rulemaking change. Now, pivoting to post-secondary education, I think this is one of the great overlooked aspects of the pandemic and connectivity. Even at the University of Virginia, we sent 25,000 students home. We have no clue who is un- and underconnected. So one of the major questions that I'm trying to address with my research now, and something that I'm trying to get the administration to pay attention to, is what is our being UVA or any post-secondary education institution's responsibility to un- and underconnected students, right? When we send them all home, why did we have this presumption of connectivity? Because you're absolutely right. It is an equity issue. It's a diversity issue. It's an inclusion issue. Who is most likely not to have an internet connection at home when they go home because of a crisis? Rural, low income, Black, Latinx, LGBTQ, and any sort of combination therein, right? What is our responsibility to these students? So this has kind of been my crusade, for lack of a better word. I can just kind of anecdotally, I did a survey in the Department of Media Studies in 2020 about connectivity. Upwards of 50% of our majors expressed concern, and we're a huge major, expressed concern over their internet connection when they went home. And what breaks my heart is when I hear students say, well, I'm really worried that a professor will deduct marks because I can't keep my camera on because I don't have a connection. Or my professors don't trust me when I say, I got booted off my home's Wi-Fi because 4 other people were on it during a test, right? We need to make sure that we have rules and regulations in place at UVA and at other institutions to make sure that these un- and underconnected students are both protected and that we recognize our own responsibility. I recently learned, for instance, that UVA owns a tremendous amount of what's called CBRS spectrum. And I'd love to see us experiment with community Wi-Fi to see if there's ways that we can bring Wi-Fi into the community. Anyways, this is my talking point. This is my soapbox. I apologize. That was a very long answer, but thank you for that excellent question.
So Lenora Atkins, she's a UVA alum, and she's also a member of the Chickahominy Indian tribe of Virginia. And she said, did your research also show the cost associated to consumers for that last mile? She said, for example, we have a tribal citizen in Charles City County, who was quoted a price of $18,000 by Comcast to connect from the box on the fiber path to the citizen's home.
Thank you for that comment, and it's not the first time I've heard this. This is particularly the case in rural communities and tribal communities where the provider does not want to service that last mile and then puts the onus onto the consumer to pay for every single cent of it, right? I actually start my book with a story of a farm being quoted $400,000 for a fiber optic line. I mean, this is ridiculous. And this is where I actually think that we need to reframe how we think about broadband. It is not just a consumer good. Broadband is not like buying a toaster, right? Broadband is a necessary social and public good. But we have no type of regulations around the pricing of that. So therefore, there's nothing legally stopping Comcast from charging that person $18,000 if they want their home connected. And this, I think, is one of the more egregious things about broadband in this country. Americans pay the most already in the developed world for broadband. The average cost of broadband per month in this country is $84 a month. That is ridiculous. But it's because it's been left, in my opinion, my scholarly opinion, entirely into the auspices of the private market with very little regulatory oversight. And that's definitely something I would love to change, because it is egregious that Comcast would tell someone $18,000 or you don't get it, right? We need that kind of behavior needs to stop. Sorry, that's another soapbox.
So this is really our last question. It's kind of a big question, but just in a couple of minutes, what can we learn from other countries as well that are doing this right?
I think one of the things we can definitely learn is that we are not alone in the difficulties of connecting rural areas. I think oftentimes when we look at countries, we compare the United States to two different countries, South Korea and Estonia. Both have phenomenal broadband networks and phenomenally cheap broadband networks. Their citizens are super connected, which is great. The difference is that South Korea is incredibly vertical, right? It's incredibly built up. And Estonia is totally tiny with very few people living in it. It is better to look at countries like Canada and Australia when we talk about connecting rural areas, because there we have a problem with geography. Huge swaths of land with very few people living on it, right? Canada and Australia are actually doing no better than we are. I giggle because, I'm Canadian. I always want Canada to be doing better, but Canada is also very much struggling with its connectivity, specifically connectivity with what's called First Nations people and the Inuit and Dene people in the Canadian Arctic. This is a difficult issue. All three countries, though, suffer from a lack of competition. There's a lack of competition amongst providers. Australia tried to publicly fund a broadband network. It was called the National Broadband Network, the NBN. It became the most expensive infrastructure project in Australia's history. They promised fiber to the home for everyone. Now they've got kind of this patchwork of fiber and satellite and fixed wireless and mesh networks. It's totally messy. I guess what I'm trying to say is this is a very difficult situation that we're in. I would love it if we did more comparison. I'm doing a big study right now comparing broadband provision in 38 different countries. So hopefully I'll have a better answer for you. But if we just look at the three biggest countries in terms of geography, each of these countries is struggling with connecting its rural and remote peoples. Doesn't mean that it's forgivable, doesn't mean that it's all right, but it is a struggle that is not unique to the United States.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Christopher. That's our time. So thank you so much for your knowledge and your expertise in sharing your latest book with us and your research. And I know that I've learned a lot more about the complexity of this issue, and I'm sure so many of our participants have as well. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you everyone for listening and watching. I really appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So I want to take a moment and bring an upcoming Lifetime Learning program to your attention. On Tuesday, November 30th at 3 p.m., I hope you'll consider joining me for a virtual program entitled Hanukkah and the Jewish Experience at UVA in the Classroom and Beyond. I'll be joined by a distinguished panel. First, James Loeffler, the J. Berkowitz Professor of Jewish History, and the Ida and Nathan Kolditz Director of Jewish Studies. Also, the Rabbi and Professor Vanessa Oakes of the UVA Departments of Religious Studies and Jewish Studies, and Rabbi Jake Rubin, the Executive Director of the Brody Jewish Center at UVA. All will be joining me on that date. So I hope you'll consider signing up for that one. So check out other Lifetime Learning programs, the podcast library, and our UVA Speaks podcast series to watch and listen to our expert UVA faculty. You can find all Lifetime Learning events and online resources at our website at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. In the meantime, please stay safe and be well. We're going to keep the program information up on the screen for a few moments. But for now, I want to thank you for being with us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.